It's my pleasure to welcome Brian Alexander. He's a former columnist for NBC, #1 best-selling author of Glass House, The 1% Economy and the Shattering of the All-American Town, and his newest book, Hospital, Life, Death, and Dollars in Small Town America. He's also the author of The Chemistry Between Us, Love, Sex, and the Science of Attraction. We should do another interview on that one, Brian. How are you? Good to have you. Where are you located?
Thank you. I'm in San Diego.
Oh, okay, great, good stuff. So, why the small town angle? I'm curious. Did you live in a small town in the past?
I grew up in Lancaster, Ohio, which is the setting for a Glass House, and I realized at one point that I had gone off. I had left Lancaster. I had gone off, become a journalist, and at one point traveled all over the world, and partly to escape my small town. But I began to realize that in 21st century America, the fate of small towns, the fate of industrial America is really one of, if not the biggest story happening in the country right now. So for Glass House, I moved back to Lancaster. And for the hospital, I moved to Bryan, Ohio. So I really immersed myself in these places.
Fantastic. Well, you're like a deep cover journalist. So that's excellent. How is the 1% economy shattering small town America? What do you mean by that? What's the premise?
Well, let me just tell you what happened in Lancaster, Ohio. The largest employer there was the Anchor Hocking Glass Company. If you have a glass measuring cup in your house, there's a very good chance you're going to see a small anchor on the bottom of that cup. That's made by Anchor Hocking. Or a baking dish, very likely to be made by Anchor Hocking. At one point, Anchor Hocking was the world's largest maker of glass tableware. They employed over 5,000 people in Lancaster alone, but they had multiple plants all over the United States. Well, through a long series of events, Anchor Hocking was placed in the sights of Carl Icahn in what was then in the 80s called a Greenmail operation.
Right.
It then fell into the hands of Newell and then Newell Rubbermaid. It was divested from that. Then it was taken over by private equity. Private equity used highly leveraged debt to buy the company. They then, in my view, looted the company of assets, and the company ended up declaring bankruptcy twice.
Yeah. So just to give a little background on this, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this. This is the story of the corporate raiders, right?
Exactly.
That became so famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, in the 80s mostly, I think, and. One of the things they would do is they would look at a company and they would value it based not on the normal valuation metrics, right? The income the company produces, the goodwill, the brand, so forth. They would look at the assets the company has. They'd take it over, usually in a hostile takeover, through the stock market, of course. And then they would split up and sell off the assets piecemeal. And then they would do something that I've never understood real well, but you said it. They would greenmail the board, meaning they'd get rid of the board. And I don't know exactly how greenmail works. I did know that at one point a long time ago, but can't remember. And, they'd get rid of that board so they could make all the decisions, right, to do all these things. And they'd have a lot of layoffs and suffered, a lot of criticism. Carl Icahn, I think especially, was one of those, who was thought of as very ruthless and, a lot of layoffs. But what do you have to say about that?
Well, Greenmail is basically, I come into your company and I say, guess what? I now own 5% of your company. I'm going to make an awful lot of trouble for you if you don't buy me off. So that's what Anchor Hocking did. They bought off Carl Icahn. They paid a premium for his stock shares, and he did go away. But what that did was it put Anchor Hocking in what's called in play. It made Anchor Hocking a target for all the other sharks out there. And ultimately what happens in the private equity world, which happened in the 2000s to Anchor Hocking, was private equity loaded up so much debt on this company that it couldn't survive. Workers pay the price for that. It's a disaster for towns. It's a disaster for communities. It's a disaster for the actual employees.
I just want to have you play the devil's advocate with me for that on a moment, for a moment, if you would. And I got to say, he is maybe my favorite economist, not for this reason, but he coined or at least popularized the phrase creative destruction. And that was Joseph Schumpeter. And, people would argue that these companies were maybe already inefficient or they were in dying industries. And, they need this kind of alchemy in the economy to move things around and reallocate resources in better ways. I think that's what someone would say if they were arguing this with you. And I'm not necessarily, maybe I'm a little bit, but what do you think about that?
I think that's an incredibly self-serving description, trying to make a virtue out of a vice. It also is, in the case of industries like the glass industry and anchor hocking, creative destruction has only one side of the coin, and that's the destruction part. There's nothing creative about it. It's not
what's creative, though, they would say, look, we've got to make way for newer industries or automation or more efficiency, or, I mean, you could argue that if this stuff didn't happen, as much as it hurts at the time, and I get it, believe me, I'm no fan of the corporatocracy, okay? Not at all. I criticize it all the time. But, people wouldn't retool. Businesses wouldn't retool. They wouldn't go into more innovative things and industries, right?
That's the argument people make. I believe it's a fallacious and untrue argument. Let me give you another example.
Sure.
Retail in this country is currently devastated. One of the most famous recent bankruptcies is Toys R Us. 33,000 Americans lost their jobs. It was run and owned by private equity. Well, you could say, well, look, it just proved that everything's online now. It just proved that old-fashioned brick and mortar really is not where it's at these days. This is an example of creative destruction. In reality, what happens is when they buy these companies, they load up so much debt that it handcuffs the companies from being able to innovate. It handcuffs them from being able to be creative. This is what happened to Anchor Hocking. They loaded up so much debt on the glass company, they had a hard time doing R&D. They had a hard time keeping up the factory, investing in new machines, because they had to service that debt.
But the loading up of the debt, isn't that on the acquisition? So that's post, or I mean, that's not post-acquisition, but that's to do the acquisition. Anchor Hocking and Toys R Us, are you criticizing their debt prior to the acquisition?
No.
Or the takeover?
So what happens typically in a private equity takeover, private equity might put in 5%, maybe 10% of their own money. They form a blank check company, a SPAC,
right?
An empty suit. They go out and they borrow tons of money. The SPAC then merges with Anchor Hocking in this case, and that new company now carries that debt.
So how do we fix this then? Do we outlaw SPACs? I mean, a lot of this stuff happened before SPACs were popularized, though. I mean,
look, here's one thing that's been talked about over and over and over again, and the private equity firms all use this. It's called the carried interest loophole.
Right.
Carried interest is taxed as regular income, not capital gains. So there is an incentive to loot these companies of their assets, because the partners in the private equity company are not going to get taxed at the capital gains rate, which is the way it should be. You could close that loophole today, and it would help disincentivize this kind of behavior. There was an innovation in somewhat recent legislation that said private equity has to hold on to the companies a little bit longer than they were doing. That's good. It doesn't solve the problem. I think you could have limits on the amount of debt. You say, look, you cannot put a certain ratio of debt on these companies. Lower that ratio so that the companies aren't quite in so much debt. There are a number of things you could do.
Yeah, interesting. Now, why? I mean, I know that in say the 80s and 90s for sure, but I don't know if it's as true nowadays. You mentioned specifically small town America. I mean, this is not just limited to small town America anymore at all, right?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
It's not. but big cities often have enough heft. They often have enough diversified manufacturing or diversified industrial base. They can withstand some of this. A town like Lancaster, Ohio, where the largest employer was the glass company, or in the case of the new book, the hospital, where the largest employer was a company called Arrow, A-R-O. They were taken over in the mergers and acquisitions craze of the 80s, and all those jobs, over 2,000 jobs, ended up being shifted to a right-to-work state, so they didn't have to deal with unions. When you do that to a town, you gut the town and you gut that community.
What happens? Do these people leave, say, Lancaster, for example? Do they move to another town? Do they move to where the jobs are? Or do they just kind of stay put?
It depends on the town. Some people do leave these towns. Other people wind up working for lower wages. So in the case of Williams County, Ohio, which is the setting of the new book, The Hospital, there's now a big Menards distribution center, which is a big Midwest home improvement retailer. So people go to work at a place like that. That's now the largest employer. And the starting wages there are $14.50 an hour. Whereas before they might have worked at Arrow and be making $20, $21, $22, $25 an hour. Those jobs are gone and they're being replaced by lower wage jobs. And as a result, people are living worse and they're living in poorer health. It's my argument in The Hospital that the current American economy is literally killing people. And it's doing that through mechanisms of inequality.
Yeah. And I agree with you. It seems, though, that if, for any person who's a worker, if you will, it's not wise to live in a one-horse town because there's no competitive market for your labor, right? Where there's a more competitive market, where there's more choices for the employee, they can shop for a better deal with another employer. So this, I don't know that we can rest all this on the feet of the corporate merger or the corporate takeover people. Some of it's just that they're not in a market that's big enough to where they have enough job choices and opportunities, right?
Well, you're taking the buy a U-Haul side of the story, which is what a famous columnist once said. They said, "Look, these people just need to buy a U-Haul and pick up and move." So that's one way to look at it. But you're only looking at the...
Well, I'm saying maybe don't settle there in the first place because a small town doesn't offer as many opportunities, right?
Sure. But look, there are different kinds of capital. There is cash capital, but there's also social capital.
Sure.
So let's say I grow up in Bryan, Ohio. All my cousins, aunts, uncles, family, everybody I know in the world is there. I have a high school diploma.
Right.
Am I going to move to Denver? What job am I going to get in Denver that's going to be different than a job I'm going to get in the area I live in? And in the process of moving, the expense, everything else, I'm also sacrificing all this social capital over here.
Yeah.
Am I really going to be better off? You got to look at it from the point of view of people whose assets are not bank accounts, they are relationships with other people.
Sure. And, being able to form other new relationships in places is an important skill, no question. I mean, I kind of take the example of my mother, right? She grew up in upstate New York in a little tiny town on a farm, 5 kids. She's the middle of 5. And literally every one of them, the moment they turned 18, left and moved to California. Like all of them, and they all live there now, except now my mom moved out of California. But, it's just kind of interesting that they just didn't feel there was any opportunity there, and they didn't want to live on a farm, and they didn't want to live in a small town. They wanted to move to San Francisco, Sacramento, LA, that's where they went.
And people still do that. In Williams County, which is the setting of the hospital, the population is in fact decreasing. Often when young people, those people who go off to college, they're having a very difficult time getting those people to return because what are they going to return to? So I'm not saying that nobody ever wants to leave. Of course, people do want to leave, but oftentimes people feel that they don't really have the choice to leave.
well, they don't feel they have the choice, but I don't know that can be fixed, if they don't feel they have the choice. But part of this is sort of the scale problem. And I'm really concerned about this nowadays with these big tech companies. I think they've become incredibly abusive. Amazon is just rolling over the entire world. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. And I think this comes down to, the fact that there's really just like no interest in the past many decades for any antitrust enforcement anymore, and we look at the censorship problem with these big tech companies, and there just doesn't seem to be any interest by Republicans, Democrats, since AT&T was busted up, to have any real antitrust stuff anymore. And monopolies are scary, or duopolies are scary enough, right?
A key part of the new book, The Hospital, because healthcare is becoming monopolistic and oligopolistic. And the reason it's doing that is pricing power. And so what you have...
What power did you say?
Pricing
power. Yeah.
Yep. So what you have are these gigantic health systems now that are taking over entire regions of the country. And they are becoming, in essence, a monopoly. And it's been shown over and over again through economic research that when you have this consolidation in healthcare, which is really speeding along at an incredible pace, prices rise and quality either does not increase or it can actually decrease. Yeah. And that's why the hospital, which is the subject of the book, The Hospital, is struggling to remain independent. It's trying not to be taken over by one of the health systems because it feels it can serve its people better by being an independent.
Right. And a big part of this problem really comes, you address it in our discussion initially, but it comes way before that, really, just the way capital formation works in this country. There's almost no choice in coffee shops anymore. It's all Starbucks now, right? And, I hate Starbucks personally. I think their coffee and food is poisonous. It's giving everybody diabetes, cancer, and obesity. It's absolutely awful. And the big tech companies, all the venture capital rushes to these big tech companies. They're not financing steel mills and, more traditional businesses. Nobody cares about financing that stuff. They're all going for the bright, shiny objects. So they throw all their money at Amazon and Facebook, and these companies just become incredibly abusive. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, as the saying goes.
This is how you end up having booming cities and booming economies on the two coasts and a hollowed out middle. And what you get when you have a hollowed out middle is a lot of disaffection, a lot of despair, and you end up with the political turmoil that we have just lived through. So the implications of all this are very big.
And interestingly, those hollowed out people and those disaffected people are largely Trump supporters. That's part of the populist movement, which is kind of counterintuitive almost, isn't it?
Trump just didn't come out of nowhere. He came out of a 40-year period from Ronald Reagan to today that really disregarded big swaths of our country. I would count both parties in that. Bill Clinton himself has a fair amount to answer for, actually.
Oh, yeah, NAFTA. How's that one?
Yeah. So there's a lot of forces at work that really have played and have really paid for it. It's all coming home to roost right now.
Yeah. And I don't see it getting any better. Now, there's one slight change, and that would be, COVID, right? Because that has caused flight out of these cities and into more suburban markets. So, that'll even out the flow a little bit, but it's not going to be extreme for this issue that you mentioned. What has to happen is the change in capital formation, not going to the winner-take-all society and all these tech companies.
Yeah, the last 25% of the hospital deals with the COVID pandemic. And the reason it does is not only because it's an obvious health issue, but it really reveals the fault lines that we've been trying to ignore for the last 40 years, with issues of inequality, low wages, the gutting of some of these towns. I mean, it's really become very obvious. The people that we call our essential workers, and we're all praising our essential workers, we couldn't even get them a $15 an hour minimum wage. We're going to have to try that again, in my view. But they are dying faster and catching it more often. COVID, I'm referring to, because they've got to go out and work. They don't get to work from home. So, and often those people are minorities. So we're also dealing with the entrenched racism in our country. COVID is really exposing a lot of things we wanted to overlook for a long time.
And it's accelerating a lot of things too. The problem you have, though, is like I just read an article maybe 2 weeks ago about the Hero Pay initiative in California and how grocery stores are now closing. They're limiting their hours. They're literally closing down in some cases completely. And, you know, when you raise the minimum wage, who's paying the minimum wage? The small businesses, right? They don't have any margin. They're not big tech companies.
These grocery stores that closed down were not small businesses. Kroger's is the #1 grocery retailer in the United States. They can afford to keep a store open in Long Beach, California.
Right. But there are some mom and pop stores for sure. My neighbor literally owns an Italian market. Like that's a mom and pop store. You know, these are two young kids that own this market. Yeah, I don't know. The minimum wage thing, I just think it goes back to capital formation more than anything, these monopolies. Because interestingly, Jeff Bezos, who I don't think is any kind of a good person, okay, by any means, he's a shark, okay? And granted, we all love the cheap prices and the convenience, and he's done an incredible thing. But, interestingly, he does not treat his workers well, and there's tons of stories about that. This is not my opinion. And he was against the minimum wage increase, and then he was suddenly for it when maybe he had the epiphany that it would put his small business competitors out of business because they couldn't afford to pay it, but he could. So suddenly he's lobbying for minimum wage, $15 an hour. And it's just a sham. Things are not what they appear to be.
Yeah. I mean, look, people are making, in Williams County, Ohio, where the hospital is set, there are people working full time that qualify for Medicaid. And that also damages the hospital, because Medicaid reimburses at a much lower rate than private or employer-based insurance does. So the hospital then suffers. In the case of Menards privatizes the profits and socializes the risks.
Right.
They put the responsibility for healthcare for their people essentially on the government, because those people don't make enough money and they qualify for Medicaid.
Yeah, these are complex problems, and we could debate the Walmart thing too. Same idea there. Interesting. So where people can get the books in all the usual places, of course.
All the usual places. I always, just as you were describing, I always encourage people to buy books at their local bookseller.
Couldn't agree more.
But they can get it anywhere that they would normally get books. And I appreciate people's interest. I think it's an important issue, and I hope people go out and buy the book.
I do too. And what's your website or whatever you want to share?
I'm at brianralexander.com.
Excellent. brianralexander.com. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Appreciate the time.